So I'm going to start today, everybody, about looking at the design elements, the foundation of things that we can use as designers, the foundation of things that we can see as designers, the language that we use for this. So we'll work through these, and I want you to be thinking about them as you work on any project or when you see anything related to design. Like I said, this is the foundation and the basics: line, shape, color, I join color and value, and then texture. And those, if you've taken an art class or if you've taken a design class before, you've looked at those terms, maybe in a different collection, maybe in something similar. I'm just using those as our starting point. And then we actually think about how do we create this illusion of space as well. So line, shape, color, and value, and texture and space. And any time that we work, we know our format. And our format could be square, it could be round, it could be rectangular, etc. And as soon as we put something in that space, it starts to send a message of some sort. So if we put it smack in the center, smack dab in the center, we might picture something might come to mind. But if we move that, and again, it's just a dot, and a dot is a foundation of what we're doing. We create lines by actually joining dots. But if we move that dot up in the upper left-hand corner, it's a different message that it sends. If we move it down to the lower right, closer to the bottom, it's going to send a different message. So we might see or notice things differently based on our format, based on our placement of things. So just thinking about the basics with that. As we actually use repetition, we can draw attention to a specific area. You might see on the left this space in the lower right hand corner that is nothing's there, so our eye gets drawn to that. And it's just using repetition. If we go to the right, you might see something differently by using value change. And using that value change, the ones that are gray go into the background, ones that are black come towards us. And you might see an actual triangle made as well. When we think about lines, there's a lot of different ways that we can create lines, right? So we could just draw something horizontally. We could draw it thick, we could draw it thin, we could do thick to thin, kind of changing and modifying there. We might change the color, we might change the way that it's drawn, right? And that sends a different message as well, adds to that meaning. So thinking about line in a variety of different ways can work to your benefit, and you want to be focused related to your overall plan and theme. An easy way of just grouping lines, if you look at the top two, those are what we call actual lines. We can be straight, we can be curved, we can be flowing, but they're connected. Actual lines is what that one's called. The second two are called implied lines. There's not actually a line there. It's been implied that there is. So that's dots, or dashed connections that way. Another tool that designers can use is psychic lines. So it's often, and in this case at the bottom, you see the finger pointing. There's not an actual line there between the finger and the black circle, but there's a psychic line. Where we also see those is in our use of eyes or arrows, something like that. So again, just some samples here of what we can do just creating using only lines. We can change thickness, we can change completion, we can change rotation, little things that we can do, same color, but we actually see something on the left versus on the right where it's just similar lines repeated. However, if you look at the reflection on the right of the bird-like illustration, if you look at the reflection on the water, it's curved lines, so that tells us even more. So using lines in a variety of ways. If you're in multimedia, for example, you might look at how do we show motion. Again, that's in graphic design, but if you think about multimedia as well in our planning, how are we showing How are we setting the structure, the story, the theme? How are we working with that just by using lines, getting the basics? Here's an example of Bic, who makes a variety of different things. In this case, should be an ad for a pen. And we look at how lines are made that way. And it can kind of tell us that story. Here's if we combine actual, implied, and psychic. You might get drawn to a particular character first. You will see actual lines creating this painting. You might see implied lines along the shoulder of the figure in the middle. You might also look to your left and see these shapes down the individual's arm that kind of help guide you with an implied line. This one's kind of clever in its use of psychic lines. So you notice eye contact, right? So you go from one to the other just based on how their eyes are directing you. And then you look at the figure on the left, and those eyes are actually looking down, and you follow the line, you follow the arm, and this person is actually getting pickpocketed. Right? So it's a use of combination of actual, implied, and psychic there. Another way that we can group lines is by using their direction, so horizontal, vertical, and diagonal. Diagonal is going to give us the most movement, the most action. Horizontal is going to make it more calm and relaxed, perhaps. Vertical might give us more use of power or aspiration. And how you use those lines can be helpful. So again, we talked about actual, implied, and psychic, and talk about direction, horizontal, vertical, and diagonal, just different ways of looking at lines. As designers, you can use lines to build frames, go around text, highlight that, go around an image, emphasize something over something else. You can actually look at texture, you can look at patterns, you can look at letter forms, all different ways that you can use lines. So here's some more examples just looking at lines and how you guide the viewer through. And the one thing that I'll show you that's kind of, it has that repetition in the background to make a texture of lines. But if you look at in the upper right corner, there's a curved line of psychic direction of these skiers, kind of guiding you down to the brand name. We can combine lines. We can use rectangular sharp edges, and then combine that with curved lines to combine. We can just use line as an add-on. We can again create illustrations as well. We can guide the viewer through, use it as a foundation and say, here's the text that you need to see, follow this line and you'll get it. We can make it straightforward and simple, so we're grabbing the attention of the viewer and then guiding them down based on the figure of the human with the implied lines or the psychic lines to the text at the bottom. We can help and create organization. We can help guide the viewer into understanding, here's what's most important, second most important, etc. And again, repeating, we can use shapes and we can use letter forms. We can create illustrations using lines. So we get some variety here. We can make it real basic, but we can use vertical, combining that with the horizontal or the diagonal use of the face in the lower left. We can add some style if we want, if that adds meaning to it. Again, just lines, but we understand the message. And we guide the viewer. So we know that this one's going to be on a train, guiding them down to name, location, destinations, etc. So here's an example of how line is used to share information. And this is a looking at campaign of Napoleon and how his individuals, his team was going from one location to another. And what you'll notice is that if you're drawn to the thick tan-like line. We're going quite wide to skinny over in the upper right in Moscow and then guiding back. And that actually shows data in a more interesting way than just looking at a table. So design and lines can work in our benefit. Okay. Shape is another way of we combine lines into shapes, and the shapes we can actually develop into cubes if we really want to, or in terms of 3 dimensions. But we use shape as designers, thinking about the basic shapes, circles, squares, and triangles, and we go from there. Shapes. We can create shapes by using borders. We can create shapes by using gradients. We can use shapes by creating fills. So we can combine those in a variety of ways as well. We can have a shape with a stroke and a fill. We don't need to, but we can. We can also look at the negative space to create shapes. So how many shapes do you see at this example in the lower right? You might see 4 actual rectangles, orange, blue, yellow, green. You might see negative space in the center. You might see an overall shape, and you might see 4 shapes in the corners too. Just a different way. How can we make shapes? Well, we can add style. We can add and create them in a different way. They can be really accurate and precise. They can be more representational. They can be very flexible. They can be open or closed. A lot of different ways that we can create shapes. We can use shapes to replace images. As we're working, we can help emphasize something. Hey, see this first. Maybe we put a shape behind it. We can create, again, organization, understand more information that way, guide the viewer, make it more interesting to look at, or just create something that helps us kind of unify everything as we work. And one way to think about this is by thinking about figure and ground, also known as actual and implied. And how can we grab attention? How can we use foreground and background? So figure and ground, positive and negative, foreground and background. Those 3 ways we can look at them. Figure and ground, positive and negative, foreground and background. How can we use that to add meaning or to help draw attention to one area over another? Some samples here. Just looking at positive and negative space, looking at simplifying what you're making. And how can you use negative space to your advantage? Things don't need to be complete, but that figure and ground, what do you see on the left? What do you see on the right? Again, simplifying positive and negative space. What do you see on the left? What do you see on the right? Escher was one artist who actually worked with that play of figure and ground quite a bit. So if you go from left to right and pay attention to what's black, you might see a change. If you go from right to left, you'll see, and focus on the white, you might look at something and notice something different. Pretty fascinating. Another thing that we look at, so we've looked at line, we've looked at shape. Color we're going to build into a second part of as we continue on and understand color both as designers looking ahead. Real basic ways here of looking at color. On the left we have actually red, RGB. Red, green, and blue is our primary colors. We're mixing light. Absence of light is black. We add red, green, and blue light, and we get white. So if you think about working on screens, that's one mode of color. If you look on the right, we have yellow, red, yellow, and blue, where we start with white, and we mix those colors together, and we get black. When we actually work in that mode, that's for printing, that's for use of ink, it's for use of paint, etc. And we add things to that. But in our design world, we're working with cyan, magenta, and yellow. And those 3, again, when we mix those, they make black. However, in theory only, so we actually add a black. So when we use CMYK, that's that mode. So we combine, we work on screen, and then we print, and no, there's overlap there. We have to be aware as we're transitioning that things may not look the same on the screen as they do in print. Another tool that designers use is actually color of Pantone. It's a color system that has identified specific colors, and when we use a Pantone color, not RGB, not CMYK, we can actually convert it and know that what we see on screen is going to be exactly what it looks like on print, which is exactly what it looks like on a website, on our phones, etc. So Pantone is a tool that designers can use to help make sure that color is accurate and precise and what we should see. And we'll kind of get into that as we move into color. So that's why color here is pretty short. But what you notice here in the middle, red, yellow, and blue are our primary colors, and then green, orange, and violet are our secondary colors, and then we go out to tertiary colors from there. And just some basics of color, how we talk about color. We can use color to help draw attention to something. We can use color to add symbolism. So knowing who your audience is, knowing who your maybe it's emotional, maybe it's time in history, maybe it's what culture you're thinking about. That is important. There's colors that might mean death in some cultures, and in another culture it might mean marriage, right? So thinking about who your audience is really important, and how you use color that way. We also associate color with a particular brand. You might know that Caterpillar's color is different than John Deere's color, is different than International's colors. So how do we connect it? And it might be food, it might be Coca-Cola versus Pepsi kind of thing. Create illusions of space or movement as we use color that way, so help guide the viewer through. And when we think just about type only, words, how can we have enough contrast in color so that we can read it? I combine value here in this sense with color. So we talk about color and value, and thinking about relative lightness and darkness, and how we use those can work to our benefit. We can add in information here. So we're looking at the southeast part of the United States in the 1860s, and this is showing how each one of these little shapes is a county, and communicating the population of the slave population in the southern U.S. And if you look at the value of these different counties, you'll notice they might have had more slaves than others. It tells us a message which is much more strong and clear about that time period, that issue, than just looking at a table. There's a nice use of value that way. We can draw attention to something where there's a high contrast in between one area and another. You can think about what we should see first. Again, the text in the lower right might jump to us where there's more contrast in value, and the faces go back because there's less contrast in value. You can look at high contrast grabs our attention, combined with scale and style and the use of line in that way. Texture is another component that we can use, and you might start with the way something physically feels, but if we're working on something that is visual, we might create that illusion of it. So yeah, when we look at magazines or we look at books, we might run our fingers across it and we'll see the way that it's been printed, which adds a texture to it. The type of material that it's used, the type of paper it's printed on makes a difference with that. Visual, though, is something that we can use photography. Maybe we're using illustration, maybe you use it by hand, but it creates this illusion. And it's something that you can use. So using photography here, we kind of get the sense of comfort, or we get the sense of sharp, or we get the sense of smooth or rough just by looking at an image. You can use this texture to create a pattern. You can use this to show foreground and background, show the illusion of space. it can actually guide the viewer or grab their attention as well. So just repeating shapes to create this pattern of what's on the wall behind this figure, just using rectangles with some variety, creates this pattern, this texture. Just repeating shapes and color. The lines are not exactly perfectly similar on purpose, so it looks like hair. Or we can even take text and adjust the space of it vertically to create this gradient, light to dark, top to bottom. But how we use the idea of texture can help guide us through it. It can help share the information, kind of grab our attention too. Make things readable, make things prioritized. Here's what you should see first, second, and third. You have this idea of trompe-l'oeil too, which is this illusion of creating something that looks real, but it's not real. And you're like, no, wait, why is this soda floating? Design can work in that way to create an interesting texture as well. And that's been used quite a bit over buildings and architecture. In this case, it's on a truck, but it's just kind of a way of, you kind of look at it differently. When we take all of those items, line, shape, color, value, texture, and combine them, how do we use and how do we show space and depth? Well, horizon line and vanishing points are an easy way of using depth. Things go from foreground to background. They go from close to us to far away. It gives us a different point of view. So that's a standard way of looking at it that we may pay attention to or have paid attention to before. We can use this quite a bit. We can use something like overlapping as well to show space or depth. We see the white car behind because the red car is in front of it, it's overlapping it. So that can work to our benefit to show depth, overlapping. We can use scale. We can make things size and exaggeration, perhaps. This is a ship, but we don't see the whole ship. We can still understand. One is angle. We're looking up. Two is we're not actually seeing the whole thing, so scale is big. It can help show space. See what's near and far. We can actually take and using similar shapes, left versus right here. We have the left is a bunch of similar shapes that change in size or scale. That can be helpful. We get it a little bit harder on the right to see what's noticeable first. Just by using everything's black and white, you might look at a different shape to help draw you in to a particular area. So changing scale, but changing value as well can help. And how something changes. In the lower right, you might see those three white circles before you see the biggest circle because of value changes. So its interaction with the background might help draw your attention and create this illusion of space. Moving things up vertically, the location can help. We have all this going on in the lower left, and then all of a sudden there's this open space at the top, but it's bigger, color's different, more contrast, but it's also at the top. Maybe that helps understand that that's what you should see first. So you can use that, you can change color, you can change angle, you can use leading lines which help point you through it. Using the same shape or similar shapes, use similar different sizes, different colors. There's a lot of ways that you can create the illusion of space and depth. And create a hierarchy of things too. Here's what you should see first, and here's how you go from second, etc. So using lines, using shapes, using color and value, using texture, and how do you use that space? Those are some of the basics of design, the elements of design.